Hello. Today I'm going to be building the Cadet Cruiser model rocket. It's part of a 3-rocket series produced by MPC that's based on the Duck Dodger series of cartoons from the 1950s. Of the 3, this is the simplest rocket to build, and the nice thing about it, it's completely pre-colored, has a wrapped body tube with the cartoon characters on it, and all you need to do at the end of it is just apply a few stickers. As with any rocket kit, it's a good idea to compare the parts in the box with what is supposed to be in there on the instructions part list. So we've got a pre-decorated body tube here, the nose cone, the fin can, and this will be inserted into the back of the body tube. The fins will attach to this. A total of 4 fins here that will attach to that fin can. Okay, there's some small parts that may be all kind of tangled together here. The engine hook, the shock cord, and this is an actual piece of cloth-covered rubber elastic. You may have a kit that just has bare rubber. Either one of those is fine. And then for the parachute, these are the shroud lines. There are actually 3 of them in this bundle here. We'll untangle that later. Okay, 2 launch lugs. If you've built model rockets before, you may see that these are a bit thicker than a standard 1/8 inch launch lug, and the reason for the extra thickness is so that the launch rod will clear the fin can. Okay, a shock cord mount is printed on a little piece of paper here. In many model rockets this is included, actually printed in the instruction sheet. The nice thing here is you don't have to cut up the instructions. But that's actually something we'll use. It's not just a little piece of paper. These are some little adhesive discs that will be used to attach the shroud lines to the parachute. This is the parachute. It's all folded. It's got a nice printed set of Porky Pig illustrations there. This will have to be cut out, and we'll do that later on. This is actually a very big parachute for this model, and we'll talk about later on possibly substituting another parachute, especially if you're under windy conditions. Alright, the smaller tube here is the engine mount, and that will go up inside the fin can. And then finally, we have a set of decals that will be applied to the fins as we finish the model. In addition to the parts then, a few other basic tools you're going to need is a ruler, a pencil of some kind. I like mechanical pencils, but a standard number 2 pencil will work. A pair of scissors, a hobby knife, some general purpose glue. You can either use white glue like Elmer's here or some form of wood glue. The white glue is going to dry mostly colorless, and so if there are any places exposed, which there actually shouldn't be, this won't show up as glaringly. White glue also gives you a longer working time. The opposite of that, the wood glue tends to set up faster, and so you have a shorter working time, but it also means you don't have to wait as long for it to dry. Also, the wood glue is tinted, and so if you're using it in a place that's going to be visible, you may need to paint over it or something like that. For this kit, either one's fine. I really can't envision any place where you're going to see it anyway. The other thing we're going to need for this, since it does have a lot of plastic parts, either some super glue or cyanoacrylate glue, or some plastic model cement. Okay, like this here. Again, either one of those is fine. Some people have a preference of one over the other. Whichever you happen to have on hand will work for the model. And then finally, you'll probably need either some masking tape or some clear adhesive tape, either to hold things in place temporarily, or as we'll see, the adhesive tape is used in assembling part of the motor mount. Okay, first we're going to start with the engine mount or motor mount assembly. Now, unless you've had a lot of experience with building model rockets, I would really highly recommend you go through this entire video before assembling any parts of the rocket. And the reason for that is that the instructions in this are kind of vague in some places, and the motor mount is the first example of this. Okay, so we're going to take the fin can here, and the motor mount tube eventually will be mounted up inside of this. But the instructions don't really show how. Okay, so I'm going to do some dry fits here just to show you this. So this tube is going to go inside. Now I haven't attached the motor hook yet, but when it does, this tube in the end should be flush with the base of the fin can here. Okay, we don't want this sticking out at all. It should stick out of the front end just a little bit here. Okay, now one of the things you may notice if you've assembled other model rockets before is that this is kind of short. All right, if we measure this, it is all of about 5.5 centimeters or so, just over 5.5 centimeters. And typically a motor mount in a standard 18 millimeter rocket engine is about 7 centimeters long. Okay, now the reason for the shorter tube is that on this kit the engine actually hangs out about out to here, which is longer than in most rockets, but in this particular one it gives the hook enough flexibility so that we can get the engine in and out. And I'll show you an example of this as we go on. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do here, looking at the instructions, is to measure from the base of the motor mount 2 inches or about 50 millimeters. And this particular tube, when they wrapped and glued it, it's actually a little off center here. The other end is a little straighter, although even that's a little bit messy. And we can clean this up by using a little bit of sandpaper. Now I had not included this in the tools that you need, it's kind of optional. But I'm just going to use a little 220 grit sandpaper here and just kind of clean up the edges on this. You don't need to if you don't have any sandpaper. The rocket will still fly. It's just a little bit of an aesthetic problem here. Okay, and that just cleans up some of those messy edges. I haven't knocked it completely down. Okay, so I'm going to use this end on my thumb as the base. And so measuring up at 5 centimeters here, I'm just going to make a little mark. Okay, and this is where the engine hook is going to be inserted. It's just going to go right in there. So I'm going to take my hobby knife now and carefully cut a slit in here that's just wide enough for that engine hook. And really, it's all you have to do is just poke the knife in a little and then just kind of wiggle it back and forth to widen it. Okay, and I'm going to poke that through. Now, here's another kind of an oddity. This is indicating using general purpose white glue to glue this on to the tube and into that little hole we make. White glue is not going to bind to metal at all. And so in most cases, there's usually some sort of a retaining ring on here that the kit will include to help keep this in place. In the instructions, it shows using a piece of clear tape here. Now, the way they show it, that's also not very strong. Now, once this is inserted into the fin can here, that's going to increase the strength somewhat, and it's going to keep this from coming out completely, but it can still wiggle from side to side here, and that's what they're using the clear tape for. So I'm going to make a modification of this. Instead of putting a lengthwise piece of clear tape on here, I'm going to wrap it. Now, and this is a good place to use clear adhesive tape, like Scotch tape, magic transparent tape, something like that. You want something thin. Masking tape will be too thick in this particular instance. And so I'm going to put this about almost halfway down the tube here. Doesn't have to be completely exact. And I want this to wrap around almost completely. If it just overlaps, that's fine, or in this case it hasn't quite met each other. But to wrap around most of the tube this way, and then put a smaller length piece along the rest of it. So I'm going to do this right here. Now this is going to end up overlapping my wrapped area first, which may or may not cause a problem, and we'll see what to do about that here. Okay, put that right up against the metal. Okay, and the purpose of this is not to keep this hook from coming out, it's to keep it from moving side to side so much. And now I'm going to dry fit this again. Alright, it's a little snug, okay, but it does go in like that, and snug is fine as long as it's not so much that it won't move. But now, if I try and wiggle this back and forth, it's much more stable. If we put a motor in, which I've got a dummy motor here, okay, that's going to go in to there. I need to hold the other end of the motor tube. Alright, but to put this in, we just bump this over a little bit and then slide that motor in. Okay, and that's how far that motor is going to hang out of the back end of the rocket. As I said, compared to a lot of other rocket kits, this has got a lot more overhang of the motor. It's still stable, there's no problem with that. It's just something to be aware of. And then to pull it out, you just have to move this engine hook out of the way and pull the motor back out again. Okay, so now we're ready to assemble it. According to the instructions, we would actually do this first and then put a bead of glue around the edges here of the motor on each side. That's not going to be particularly strong. Okay? Instead, what I recommend doing is putting glue up on the inside. So I'm going to pull this out. Okay. And if I use plastic model cement here, what it's going to do is partially melt the plastic, and then that's going to help bond it to the paper. The glue itself does not bond paper really well. It's actually the plastic that gets partially melted that's binding on. You can use either plastic model glue or you can use super glue for this. I'm actually going to do both. I'm going to show you a process where I'm going to use both types of glue in different spots. Okay, so for the first part here, I'm going to use my plastic model glue. And I'm going to run a bead of this up inside of here. I don't want it right at the edge, but fairly close. And try not to get it down in that groove for the motor hook. It really won't hurt anything if you do. And we will put it in from the other end. And I'm just going to use the neck of my tube here to just kind of smear that around evenly. Okay. Now when we do this part, it needs to be done fairly quickly. If you hesitate a little bit, that glue may bind too early. So I'm going to set that in there, make sure the motor mount's aligned with the slot. And I'm just going to push it in firmly, all the way in there. Okay, and now there is some glue out in here. And if you're going to do this with the super glue, you want to let this dry. Okay. The other thing you can do is do this next step again with the model cement, and again you can do either one. So you could take the super glue and run a bead of this around the inside edge of the motor mount there. Because I am going to be in a little bit of a hurry and want to get this video done, I'm going to show you the other way to do it. So normally, if I were taking a bit more time, I'd use the super glue. But this does the same thing here. And what I'm going to do is just put a bead of the model cement around this edge, all the way around. Okay, you can even put a little bit down in the slot there. Okay. So the overall idea here is, instead of just putting glue along the edges of the tube, is we want glue along the entirety of that motor mount. So that gives us a good firm connection between the motor mount and the rest of the rocket. If you don't have that, if the motor mount were to come loose during the launch, it would try and travel up through the rocket, which would give a rather spectacular but devastating event where the rocket would push the recovery system and the nose cone off and blow out the end of the rocket. We don't want that. Okay, so I'm just going to give this a few minutes to dry. It does not have to cure completely for the next step. But we're going to give it a few minutes here and then come to the next step of attaching this to the body tube and then attaching the fins. So I'm going to set that aside. And just one other thing you can do at this point, if you want something to do while this is drying, is the decals that come with this are meant to go onto the fins, although it's your rocket, you can put them wherever you want, or not use them at all. But you can put these on prior to putting the fins onto the rocket. So if you just need something to do for the next few minutes, you could go ahead and attach the decals here to either side of the fin. The only thing to be careful of is that you don't get any decal material on these little wedge bases here, because these are what are going to slide into the fin can. So we'll come back here in just a few minutes and put the next pieces together. Before we go on to the next assembly, I do want to bring your attention to something inside this particular motor mount. If you've made other model rockets before, you may notice that this does not come with a thrust ring or engine block, which would be a small ring that fits right above the motor and provides a surface that the motor can thrust against and propel the rocket forward. In this kit, the opposite end of the engine hook is actually used for this purpose. And it's fine the way it is. The only problem that might occur is if you use this rocket a lot and it's gone through lots and lots of launches, the chemicals from the ejection charge could start to corrode and erode away that little clip there. And so something you can do here, if you have the parts, is to add a thrust ring to this. And there are several ways to do it. The most straightforward is go to a hobby shop that sells rocket parts and buy a thrust ring. You can buy sets of these. I get them online because I live in a little town in Arkansas that doesn't have a lot in the way of hobby shops. But you can buy these from places like, say, Apogee Components, or from E-Rockets, or lots of other online places. You probably can find them on Amazon. So that's one possibility. And what this does is it would fit right inside here, and we simply glue it into place. Okay. If you don't have that as an option, another thing you can do, if you have an old engine that's been expended, don't do this with a new one, but if you have an old one that's been expended, you can take a lightweight saw. This is a hobby saw. You could probably use a hacksaw or a lightweight wood saw, and simply cut a ring. Now, I'm not going to do that here. Okay, but you could cut just a piece of this engine casing off, making it roughly the same thickness as this engine ring, the engine block, okay, which is about 5 millimeters. What I'm going to do in this particular rocket today, and this is one of the easiest to do, is a lot of rocket kits come with a spacer like this. These ones don't because they have an engine hook, but smaller rockets like the Estes Viking and the Estes Wizard, one of which I got this tube from, have these engine spacer tubes that once you've built the rocket, you no longer need the tube. And so these are also just small enough to go inside an 18mm rocket engine mount. And so what I'm going to do here is simply cut off a small piece of this tube. Okay, that's roughly the same size as that engine block ring. And you'll hear it referred to as an engine block or a thrust ring. They're the same thing. Okay, so my cutting wasn't perfectly straight. It doesn't really need to be. Just use whichever side looks straighter. But this is about the same size now as this. It's not as thick, but that really doesn't make a big difference here. The thicker makes it a little stronger. But we're just reinforcing the hook that's already in there, so I'm not as concerned about that. And so now what I'm going to do is just take a little bit of general purpose glue. Again, either white or wood glue will work for this. And I'm just going to run a bead of this inside the top of the motor mount. Now you don't want the glue to go down too far and get in where the engine's going to be. So only put this on the very edge. A little bit sloppy there. Alright, I'm just going to take my finger here. Okay, and so that's just on the inside edge there and not down into the area where the motor itself is going to be. Okay, and then I'm going to take my ring and put it in there and just give it a little bit of a turn. You can even take a little bit of excess glue like is on my finger here and just dab that around the edge. Okay, and then I'm going to check and make sure that I don't have any drips going down there. I've got a little bit of material there that might drip. So you can use either a little dowel or a Q-tip or something like that. There we go. Alright, this is a wooden applicator. It's basically just a long Q-tip. You can use that if you need to remove any excess glue from the inside. Okay, so that's just kind of a short side problem that if you want to reinforce this, you can. If not, you can just fly this the way it is, and it should make quite a few flights. Just something to be aware of. And so what we're going to do now is insert the fin can into the base of our body tube here. And so I have not done any gluing here yet, again, so don't worry about that. I'm just going to test fit this to make sure that it goes in. Okay, it's a little bit snug, but that's good. Now if you look at the tube itself, there are some faint lines on here that extend all the way along, and also including the seam on the body tube wrap here. We're going to use one of these lines to align the launch lugs, and personally I prefer to use the seam because it gives you a little bit of a physical edge here that'll help you align things. It also makes it so when it's on the launch pad you can't see it because the seam will be up against the launch rod. Okay. Now I do want to check the orientation here of a couple of things so that when we get it on the launch rod we don't have one part of the rocket or another interfering with its function. And so the first thing is whichever you're going to use, and I'm just, for the rest of this, I'm going to assume you're going to use the seam as your launch lug guide. So when I put this on, it needs to be between where two of the fins will go. The other thing I don't want to have is the engine clip in the way of the launch rod. So here it's on the same side. I'm just going to move this over so that now my engine clip is more toward the side of where my launch rod is going to be. If you happen to not pay attention and get it there, it's not a big deal. It's just a personal preference of my own to kind of keep that off to the side. Alright, so again, we're going to be attaching two different materials here. So again, we've got some plastic polystyrene here and paper here. Again, you can use either the plastic cement or the super glue. In this case, since I don't have to worry about anything else that I've glued at this point, I'm going to use the super glue because theoretically at least the super glue is going to be stronger. If you're going to use it, I suggest using a fairly thick one. If you use the really watery kind, it tends to absorb into the cardboard fairly quickly. Alright, and again, I'm going to make sure you can put this in either direction, so you could either make this end the aft or back end, or this end. I'm trying to do it this way, so I'm going to apply a bead of glue just inside. I don't want it hanging over the edge, but I want it fairly close so that when we push the fin can in, we're going to have a nice, even layer of glue there. So this is really thick super glue. So once I've got that in, I'm going to use the tip of the tube itself to get this around. And remember, with super glues, any cyanoacrylate glue, they bond skin almost instantaneously, and then to get it off you have to use acetone. So try not to get any of this on your fingers, and especially not in your eyes. Okay, and so now I'm just going to, again, figure out where I want my alignment to be. So I want it there. And I'm going to put this in and just give it a twist back and forth a little bit. And that just helps work the glue completely throughout. Okay, and we're just going to hold that for a few seconds. Theoretically, the super glue binds within 60 seconds. Alright, and this is nice and snug. I can actually just put this down any time now. If your particular model has a little bit of looseness of the fin can in here, hold that for a few more seconds, maybe a minute or two, to make sure that the glue sets nicely before you put this down. Okay. Alright, for the next step we're going to add the fins on. Now they've got the fins after putting on the launch lugs. I'm going to do the launch lugs last because they're going to have to dry longer. So the fins simply insert into these slots. Okay, now you can put them in from either direction, but because we've got this length of fin here that doesn't actually attach in, it just holds up here, I don't want to get any of the plastic cement on this edge here. Okay, so we want to put the fins in from the front of the fin can and slide them back. Okay, and I suggest you go through and dry fit all of these first. If you kind of notice there, that part of the fin was hanging up a little bit. And so this is something to check also before you put it in, is see if there's any residual plastic or flash from when the fin was made. And so you can take your hobby knife here and just scrape that off. Try not to gouge down into it. You're just getting rid of the excess. And check the side surfaces here too. Okay, and if you see some, like there's a little bit up here, carefully just trim that off. For the stuff that's up here on the fin surfaces, you can use some very fine sandpaper on that as well. That way you don't gouge the fin. Down here on the base, you're not going to see it if you accidentally gouge it. Alright. I'm just going to go through here and just quickly remove some excess plastic. Okay, and then you'll also want to check the fin can itself. Make sure there's nothing really glaringly obvious poking into the slots. Oh, somehow I managed. Okay. I'm not sure how quite how I did that, but I did manage to get my seam in the wrong place. Okay, which means I'm just going to have to use something else as my guide, which we'll come back to. But see, I've been doing this for decades and I can still screw it up. Alright, not a big deal. We'll come back to that. Alright, now, this is another kind of a vague point here. So it shows gluing the fins, but not really how and where and why. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to put a little bit of the plastic model cement on the forward end of each of these slots. I'm actually going to fill the slot down to about here. So not very far, 1/8 of an inch, about 2 to 3 millimeters worth. Because what's going to happen then is as I push the back of my fin in, it's going to push that glue along the entire length here. And again, plastic model cement actually works by partially melting the plastic on each surface. And so this is going to be the best choice for this part because we're gluing plastic to plastic. So to show you how this works, okay, I'm going to take my glue here and just squirt in a little bit. Okay, so there's a kind of a film in there. And I don't want to do this really quickly. I want the glue to have time to spread as I put the fin in. So just do it slowly. That way we don't get it squirting up on top of the edge there. Okay, and this is a little bit tight. I'm not sure why. Now, if that's acting a little tight, what I'm going to do is just wipe this off a little bit. I'm going to have to do this quickly so that glue does not harden, but I'm just going to carve off just a little bit of that edge of that base. And a little bit of the edge of that base. And I think what happened here is I had dry fitted this, but I think I grabbed a different fin, or I'm looking at a different slot. There we go. Okay, so that's trying to bind really quickly. I'm going to have to shove. There we go. Okay, so that was a little bit harder than I expected it to be, but sometimes it happens. Okay, and now this excess I'm just going to very quickly remove. You don't want to let that sit too often because the glue, as it melts the plastic, will transfer color one direction or another. Okay, but you can see where the glue has come up just along the edge here, and that's what we want. Okay, and then as this dries, that will pretty much be almost invisible. Alright, so there's the first. Now, given the trouble we had there, I'm going to make sure and refit this. Yeah, so these are just a little bit tight. So again, I'm just going to take, and all I'm doing is just cutting off the very corner at the base of the mounting sides of these fins. And that's just to let it enter into the slots a little bit easier. Okay, so I'm going to dry fit that again. That's better. This is a very tight fin can on this one. A little bit tighter than the last one I did. Alright, so again I'm going to put in just a little bit of cement there. A little bit more. And now slide that in. Okay, and you want this flush with the back. So that's what I'm trying to get for there. Just enough. Okay, and again I'm going to wipe that off and actually use that to push very quickly. Again, don't put that on there for too long or you'll end up sticking the towel to it. Okay, but we want these flush with the base. Alright. And given our history with the first two, I'm not even going to try this before I cut this off. Make sure you don't cut your finger as you're holding this. Okay. And again, I'm just going to test fit that. That one's even tighter. So I'm just going to bring this down a little bit more. Try that again. There we go. Okay. This one I can tell is going to be really, really tight. If it's that tight, you might even consider taking a little bit of sandpaper of about 220 grit or so. Now be careful, because we don't want to hit any of the fin here. I am just sanding off the base where it attaches, and not a lot. Just enough to give us a little additional clearance. Now one of the other things this may do is make the glue bind tighter too. So we've got to be careful that we get it in fairly quickly. We stick it in there. Okay, that's a little better. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead. If your model is still really tight there, go ahead and sand it a little bit more. Okay, it's just a little bit of glue. Paper towel here and push that all the way up. Okay, and I got a lot of excess there. I'm going to wipe that off, that one. Okay, so when I'm wiping this, I'm wiping it away from the rocket so I don't carry any colored plastic up. Alright, and then we have one left. Experience now has told me that we definitely need to shave those corners. Alright, and then we'll dry fit that. It's a nice easy one. Okay. And once more, just a little bit of glue. Okay. Final fin, wipe off the excess, and make sure it's nice and flush. Okay, so we should have all four fins there, gluing nicely. Check for a little bit of excess glue anywhere, that looks fine. Okay, my fins have set. The glue is still drying there a little bit, but it should be safe to handle. Okay, so we're going to look at the launch lugs now here in the instructions. And the key thing is to put them between two fins and at approximately equal distances from the ends of the body tube. Okay, so they're suggesting here 2.5 inches or 65 millimeters from the fin can base, and then 8 inches or about 205 millimeters from the base up along the body tube here, which actually puts it about the same distance down. Now, as you recall from earlier in the video, I had originally intended to use this seam as my launch lug guide, and somehow I managed to twist this around the wrong way. That's not a problem at all. Okay, so if I go around this, I think what I did was I was actually looking at this line when I did that, and so this line is now aligned to where I would have put the seam. That's fine. Okay, so it's in between two fins, and my engine hook here is off to the side, so it's not right on the same side as my launch lugs are going to be. So here we're going to take our ruler, and I'm going to use this line here. Now if you had the same problem but you don't have a line that's in the right place, one other thing you can do is use the outline of some of these shapes. So this blue stripe that's going up along the side of the rocket, I could, if I needed to, use the edge line here as a guide and maybe just put my launch lug right off to the side on each one of those. So the nice thing is that the decorations of this body tube actually provide you with a lot of guides if you need them. So I'm going to take my ruler now, and I'm measuring 65 millimeters, all right, or 6.5 centimeters. That's going to be right here. Just going to make a little pencil mark there. And then this ruler actually does not go up to 8 inches. I'm going to change rulers. All right, so a little bit longer ruler here. And I'm going to measure 205 centimeters. Or 205 millimeters, 2.5 centimeters here. It's just right on Porky's ear. Okay, and this is the reason why I wanted to put it on the seam, is that way I also don't interfere with the decorations as much. So it goes. Okay, so now we could glue these on. And I'm going to do one other thing to it. So normally we would just take some general purpose glue and glue this on here like that. Now the launch lugs here are actually wrapped in a shiny paper, and we've got the shiny paper here. And shiny means it's going to not stick as well when we use the glue. So I'm going to roughen this up just a little bit on both sides. So if I take my launch lug here and put it so that the base is on the line that I drew, I'm going to give myself one more little line here just inside the length of the launch lug. Okay, and then I'm going to take my hobby knife and very gently use it to scrape here along that line. And what I'm doing is just taking the finish off and exposing the cardboard and paper, and it's actually the paper of the decal underneath. And I'm taking the surface here and giving it a microscopic rough surface here. And that's just going to give a better place for the glue to stick in here. And then I'm going to take the launch lug, and right along the seam here, I'm going to do the same thing. So I'm just going to, I don't want to break that seam open. I don't want to unravel this whole thing. Okay, but I do want to take off that shiny finish just a little bit so that my glue has a better place to stick. Okay, and by using that seam, when I stick that on, that's going to give a little ridge that'll help hold it in place there. Okay. So now I've got my other launch lug. I'm going to go ahead and roughen it up just a little bit again. just to the side of that seam. You can even hit the edge of the seam there. And then once more, I'm going to set this up against the body tube where I had my mark. And I'm going to mark just inside the length of the launch lug there. And here I want to be really careful because I'm going into the decoration in my case. If you didn't mess this up like I did and kept this on the seam, you won't have this problem. Widen that just a bit. Okay, so now I've got rough surfaces on which I can put my glue. Now here, given a choice between white glue and wood glue, I would recommend the white glue because this is the one area on the rocket where you might see the glue, because it may ooze out a little bit around the launch lugs. And if you don't want that yellowish color of the wood glue, then I would go ahead and do this. Alright, so what I'm going to do, and this is an old Rocketry trick that they don't tell you about in the instructions, but what we're going to do is kind of pre-glue this. So I'm going to put a bead of glue on here. I'm going to take my finger and just even it out so we don't have globs and gaps. Alright, now you got to be careful, and if you have smaller fingers, this is a lot easier. I'm going to take the glue side now and place that down along my line where I've scraped it. Alright, so that's in here, and now I'm going to pick it up again. Okay, and I'm going to wait 60 seconds. And what's happening is now the glue is going to dry just a little bit and become tacky. And now when I put it back on, the tacky glue will help hold the launch lug in place and help prevent it from sliding down one side or the other. And it just allows us to work without having to sit there and hold the launch lug in place while the glue dries. Okay. Now if you're really coordinated while you're waiting your 60 seconds or so, and I would put this on a surface that you don't mind getting glued, you can allow the second one to start getting tacky. Here my glue is kind of overflowing a little bit, so I'm just going to use, glue can be messy. Okay, and again I'm going to spread that evenly along the line. Okay, and I'm going to press this on lightly, just enough to glue there. Pull it down, and I'll let it get tacky. Now I'm going to go back to my other one here. And if you don't feel this coordinated, go ahead and just wait the full minute or so and do these one at a time. I'm trying to keep your sanity in mind of watching glue dry in a video. Okay, so now I'm just going to make sure that this is lined up along my line. I want to sight down this as well. So take a couple of points of view to make sure it's straight and even. Okay, and now I'm going to take my other one here. Make sure I've got the glue on the right side, and I'm going to tack that down as well. Okay, and again, take a couple of points of view. Now, I've got Porky's head in the way, so I don't have as much to work with here. I'm trying to have to sight down all the way to the line. Okay, and then you'll actually want to look, and it's hard to show this on the camera, but look at this like it's a gun sight. So look through the front one and center the rear one, and if the rocket still looks straight when you've got them centered, then you've got those correctly placed. This part's going to require a little bit more patience because this glue does have to dry fairly well. I would let this set at least for half an hour before going on to do any work with the body tube. Another thing we'll want to do on these when we are finished, and just in case I don't come back to this on the video, once this glue has dried, you're going to want to apply what are called fillets, and that's, you'll take a bead of glue and just put it right along this edge, and then take your finger and wipe most of it away, and that's just going to leave a little seam or fillet of glue on each side that will help streamline the launch lug and also strengthen them. But you don't want to do this until this glue is dried, or you take the risk of knocking them loose. Alright, so just be aware of that. That's usually one of the last things that we'll do on any model rocket is apply the fillets. So when we come back, we'll look at assembling the parachute. While our launch lugs are drying, we can cut out and assemble the parachute here. As I mentioned in the beginning of this is a really big parachute for this size of rocket. And unlike some kits that provide the parachute pre-assembled, this one you do have to make yourself. And so for this first step, we're simply going to take some scissors and cut along the dotted lines here. Do be careful in that there are a few places here, like up in this corner, it has some instructions on how to attach the shroud lines, so don't lose that. Oh, there goes my camera bouncing all over the place. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is simply cut out the parachute. You can use scissors for this, or you can use a hobby knife. If you use a hobby knife, I suggest taking a straight edge like a ruler and placing it along this. It gives you a cleaner edge and helps prevent you from tearing or coming off in the wrong direction. And I'm just going to cut this all the way around. And I'm going to pause the video because this is one of those really boring parts of watching someone cut a parachute. I finished cutting out the parachute, and now you're going to need these shroud lines here. And they look like they're in a big knot. They're actually kind of loosely jumbled together, and so if you carefully pull these apart and do just a little bit of patience, they'll usually just fall right open. Okay, so I'm going to grab one of these lines and separate it from the others. Okay, I'm going to set the others aside. The technique here is going to be the same, and what we're going to do is apply these in loops. So we'll have one end of the loop on this corner and one end of the loop on this corner, and the rest of it will be looped in between here, and then we'll simply rotate and do each of the sides in turn. Now these are little clear self-adhesive discs. If you lose these, or you need to replace these, or whatever, you just don't have them, you can use transparent tape on this. It just doesn't look quite as snazzy, but it will work as well. And so what I'm going to do here is peel this off. This is actually the hardest part of the whole procedure. And what we want to do is actually apply the string to the adhesive disc rather than trying to squish it onto the parachute. And what I'm going to do is make a loop here that sticks to the disc. Little fingerprints on here aren't going to hurt things, but it is a good idea to wash your hands before doing all this so you don't have a lot of oils built up on your fingertips. Okay, and now I'm just going to take this whole thing and stick it on like this. Okay, you don't have to follow the outline of the parachute completely here. Okay, and then just go on to the next disc. Peel it up. And once more, just apply the string to the adhesive. and then turn that over and press it down. Just like that. Okay. So once again here, I'm going to pause the video and complete this. All you have to do is just simply turn this to the next pair of corners and apply that there. So I'll come back here in just a few minutes while I do this, and hopefully you're doing it as well. That part's done. So I now have 3 loops. I'm not sure this will entirely fit on the video screen here. Right, there's 1 loop and 2 loops and 3. Okay. And now I'm going to turn this whole thing over because we'll actually pull it together from the back side. So when we do this, there's 1. There's 2. And there's 3. I'm just going to run these all over my finger. Now, this definitely is not going to fit in my field of view here. What I'm going to do is draw this all together. And I'm going to hold this parachute in roughly the middle. Okay, and so as I pull these taut, they should all come together roughly the same area. So all the corners of the parachute here, some are a little bit off. And if you want to actually go through and shorten individual lines, you can. But this is actually very acceptable here. This parachute will work fine. And we'll come back to this now. I'm going to set this aside, and we'll come back to attaching the parachute a little bit later on. Okay. I'm also going to show you a couple of different ways to attach the parachute. There's the way they show in the instructions, and a way that allows you to change out parachutes easily. So if you want a smaller chute, you can do that. Alright, so according to our instructions, the next step is to actually attach the parachute to the nose cone as they're shown here. As I said, I'm going to put this aside and we'll do that later because it's easier to work with the rest of the rocket if we don't have the nose cone attached yet. The same is true of this next part. They actually show putting the shock cord onto the nose cone first. We're not going to do that. Instead, we're going to assemble the shock cord mount first, put it into the rocket, and then attach the shock cord to the nose cone last. So for this part, we're going to need the shock cord anchor and the actual shock cord here. Okay. In this model, the shock cord is kind of short. It will still work, don't worry about that. But this is one of those things that as you get more into rocketry, you find that, you know, I like long shock cords because it's just less likely of damaging the rocket. So if you happen to have some sewing supplies, and one of the things you might consider is if you have a piece of 1/8 inch flat elastic like this, or if you have tubular elastics, so like 1/16 inch tubular elastic, you could use that as well. But I would suggest actually doubling the length of this. For elastic shock cords, I like to use twice the length of the body tube. And this is just over 1 length. If you don't have that kind of stuff at home, don't worry about it. Go ahead and just use this. It will still work, like I said. It does avoid some minor problems later on down the road. All right, our shock cord mount here we will have to cut out. And if for some reason you happen to cut this wrong or lose it or whatever happens, you can take any piece of paper and make the same thing. You're just making a long trapezoid of about the same length here. This particular one, what is this, about 6 centimeters or so? Yeah, about 6 centimeters. Or if you need to replace it sometime. Sometimes one of the things that will go out on a model is that the shock cord mount comes loose. And this is due to chemical reactions between the glue and the exhaust gases of the engine. Now if you notice on the instructions there's a 1, 2, and 3 marking. There's not one here, and I actually suggest that you put them in because it'll make this next step easier if you've never done it before. So I'm just going to put on here a 1, a 2, into 3. Now I'm going to take my all-purpose glue. Nothing is going to be visible from this. This will all be mounted inside the rocket, so I'm going to use wood glue because it does allow me to shorten my drying time a little bit, and nobody's going to see that it's this awful wood glue color. I don't know if I'd really call it awful. It always looks like pus to me. In one of the other videos in this series where I'm building the Martian Invader X2, I do actually show how to make a new shock cord mount from just a regular piece of copy paper. Okay, so what I've done is applied glue over the 2 and the 3 regions here, and now I'm going to put my shock cord in a little bit diagonally. The instructions always show this as being straight down, and they put the end of the shock cord pretty much in the middle of the 2 region. Okay, I would suggest you do it this way. Put the end of the shock cord almost at the line here and set it a little bit off center. And the reason why will become clear here in a minute. So I'm going to take the 1 section now, fold it at the dotted line, over and onto the 2 section. And you can use quite a bit of glue on this because you want to squish it around in there. Basically, you want a nice glue sandwich between those 2 pieces. And now I'm going to take that region, the whole folded thing, fold it over onto the 3. And this is why I offset it. If you have this going straight down, then it makes it really thick because the elastic is folded over directly on itself. This way it folds over and part of the elastic is beside the other, and there's just a thick bump down here at the bottom. All right, and again, I'm going to squish that around, get all the glue in, and I'm going to give it a little bit of a cup shape here so that the back of it looks like that. It's got an arc to it because this is the part that's going to get glued into the inside of the body tube. And so if you give it a little bit of a curve, it will glue easier to that curved surface inside the rocket. Okay. Once again, this does not have to dry completely, but I do recommend you let it set up for just a few minutes so that it's easier to handle when we get it inside the rocket body. And I'm going to use that time here to talk a little bit about why and how this is going in. So here's our rocket. My launch lugs are still gluing. It looks like they're mostly dry but not fully cured. So if you're doing this in a rush like I am here, do be really careful of your launch lugs that you don't accidentally bump them or something. I recommend that you do your launch lugs, go fold the parachute, and then go have lunch or something. Give this a good 30 to 60 minutes to dry, and even then be careful of the launch lugs there. Okay. And now I've wasted about a minute or so. And so what we're going to do is this is going to go inside the tube down here. In our instructions, this says that it needs to be at least 1 5/8 inches or 40 millimeters from the edge of the tube in. And so this is the forward edge of the tube. The base of that shock cord mount needs to be at least that distance. And the reason for that is because this nose cone has to go in, and we don't want the shoulder of the nose cone here impacting up against that shock cord mount, because it'll either mean the nose won't go in all the way, or it will go in all the way and then get stuck on there and won't eject properly. Okay, so that's really a minimum distance. I prefer to get that as far down as my finger will allow me. So if you have long, slender fingers, you can get it down there quite a ways. All right, so if I stick this in, all right, I can get my finger all the way up to this kind of swollen knuckle here. And if I measure against that, that means the base of my shock cord mount is going to be about here. Okay, and that's well beyond our minimum distance here. Okay, it doesn't matter where this goes in relation to any place else in the rocket. So it could be on the same side up inside here as your launch lugs. It could be an opposite side, it could be a random side. Okay, it doesn't make any difference. I'm actually going to end up probably putting it opposite my launch lugs because I want to leave this upright yet as the mount is drying, just to make sure those launch lugs get good and secure there. Okay, so I am going to take now this and apply, not an overly generous, but you don't want to be skimpy with the glue here. You want a good film of glue over the whole thing. You don't want it dripping out and oozing all over the place. Okay, and go ahead and get all the way up into here. If a little bit of fold number 2 is sticking up over the base, go ahead and get it with glue too. So I'm just going to smear this all over. Here, get it up onto the folded area. Okay, and now I want to try and keep as much as possible glue from getting anywhere except where I want this to be. So I'm kind of letting it hang down at about a finger's length. I'm going to drop that in and then let it settle down against the side, and now take my finger and push it firmly up against the inside. And I'm bracing this on the opposite side, so I'm holding the body tube in my left hand here, so that I'm sandwiching it between my hand and the finger inside. Okay, and I'm going to squish that all the way around, press that in really well. If you have too much glue and it's oozing around, go ahead and kind of pick that up with your finger and wipe it off. Fortunately, mine has not. Okay, and then you can set that aside again. Let everything finish gluing here. So I'm just going to go ahead and set this aside, and we're going to do a little bit of work on the nose cone and the parachute in our next step. Our last steps here are to attach everything to the nose cone, the parachute, the shock cord and such. But I want to talk about the nose cone itself. In most model rocket kits, nose cones are usually made from either balsa wood or from polystyrene. This one appears to be made of polyethylene. That's what it feels like. And the problem with polyethylene is that paint and glue don't stick to it well. And so you're kind of stuck with the color that this is. And it's a lovely color of purple. I'm not knocking that. But the molding process results in these seams on either side of it. And so if this were a polystyrene cone, I could sand this down, add a little bit of primer to fill in the groove, and then paint this, and you have a nice smooth surface all the way around. If you sand the polyethylene though, you'll see it. Okay, there's just not a good way to sand it so that it looks like the rest of the cone. And if you sand the rest of the cone, it just doesn't look good. And so for the most part, you're kind of stuck with this cone the way it is. One thing that you can do if you've got a little bit of patience and skill with a hobby knife is to gently shave down this seam here and this seam here. And I'll give you an idea of how to do this. Now, if this is your first time ever to try this, I wouldn't. I would do this with a nose cone that you can fix easier, like a polystyrene one. And this is not going to be perfect either. But what I'm going to do is just gently shave along this edge. And this works best if you have a new blade in your knife. Okay, and so I'm just really gently shaving this. I know that I am not going to get this all the way down. And sometimes I wonder if I should even bother. Okay, but I'm just going to knock it down, at least get the very edge off here. This is more a matter of aesthetics than anything else. I'm not going to make great improvements to the aerodynamics or anything by doing this. Nor do I want you to watch me do this for the next half an hour or so, which may be what it takes to do it properly. Okay, but it's something you can do. Let's go to our parachute though. Now in the instructions here on the previous page, it shows attaching the parachute to this loop here. It's kind of a triangular loop in the plastic. And if you notice, it's got a little bit of flash in there. That's just excess plastic from the mold. And this you will need to cut out. So just take your hobby knife and cut out that excess plastic. Be careful that you don't cut through the loop edge here, because that's what you need to attach the parachute to and the shock cord. Okay, it's just being a little bit stubborn there. There we go. Okay, now in the instructions, what they're going to do is have you take all of your parachute shroud lines here, and you have to find the loops once more. Okay, and so you want to pull this taut and make sure all of the shrouds are not tangled in each other. And then bring all the loops together. Okay, like that. And then extend all the way. You can't see the other side of my parachute here, but extend that all the way down, make sure it's straight. So you've got loops of all 3 cords here, so a total of 6 fibers. And what you're going to do is take that end loop and put it through here. So you have to, this is like trying to thread a needle with 6 threads all at the same time. So push that loop through. Okay, and then it shows passing the parachute through all those loops. It's actually easier to do this. Just pull them so they're about this long, and then just pass them over the nose cone, and then gently pull that taut, again keeping them even until it cinches down here. Now I'm not going to cinch this fully because I don't want to do this. I actually prefer to be able to change my parachutes. So I'm just going to gently pull this back open and take this out. I'm going to set that aside for a moment. And what I like to do is use a snap swivel. And you can get this in the fishing section of any sporting goods store. And what you want, you need the snap part here to be big enough to fit over this loop. So depending on the model, you can use really big snap swivels or you can use smaller ones. Generally you want them as small as you can get that will still fit on here and that you can manipulate the other side and work with it. So depending on how dexterous you are with your fingers. This does add just a little bit of weight to the model, and so if you're trying to get your model to go as high as possible, use a small one of these as you can. Alright, so now what I'm going to do is, instead of putting my parachute loop through the nose cone loop there, I'm going to put it through the swivel end of my snap swivel. And this is going to require bunching it up a little bit. Shoving that through. Alright, and then carefully opening this up. And again, you'll probably want to check how even and taut all of that is on your parachute. Okay, and so if you look down here on the other end of my parachute and try and get all those corners lined up with each other. And once you've got that, then you simply pass the entire snap swivel through the loop, just like we did with the nose cone. Alright, and then we pull this down, and I'm just going to pull this loop down like this, and then pull it taut. Okay, so now we've got all of our shroud lines attached to the swivel, like this. And this does a couple of things. So now we can remove the parachute completely if we're not launching, so it doesn't keep the parachute all bunched up. And in almost every case, that parachute's never completely even. And as it's coming down to the ground like this, it tends to twist. And the swivel part of this, the barrel of the swivel, allows some of that spinning action to keep the shroud lines from tangling all up. So it spins around this instead of spinning and coiling up the shroud lines like that. Okay, so now when we're ready to attach this, we can simply pop it onto here. And this is where the size of the snap comes into play, because now you've got to be able to hook that back in. And if this is too small, it won't do it. This is almost there. This is just big enough. I'm just not sure I can do it with my thumb. Try the end of my pencil here. Almost. Okay, if you got a pair of needle nose pliers, you can do this. Otherwise, what this is telling me is that maybe I need just a little bit bigger snap here. Or a little bit smaller fingers. One of the two. Okay, so probably need the next larger snap. That's fine for this purpose. Alright, so I'm going to pull that off. Now, one of the reasons that I suggest doing this, besides keeping your parachute from tangling as badly, like I said, this is a really big parachute. It's an 18-inch diameter parachute on a not very big rocket. Okay, the rocket's kind of heavy because of all the plastic on it, but we may find that when we launch this, that the wind could carry it down quite a ways away from wherever we launched it. And so we might want to replace this with a slightly smaller parachute. And by having the snap swivel here, we can simply disconnect it, go into our supplies, and find a parachute that's smaller. Okay, and you can buy parachutes from the various rocket supply companies. These ones are all made by Estes, but this is it's either a 16 or an 8-inch parachute. This is a 12-inch parachute. This is a 6 or an 8-inch parachute. And so for most conditions, for example, I might switch out the original big Porky Pig chute there, which is 18 inches, for maybe a 12-inch or 15-inch parachute that might bring the model down a little bit quicker and keep it from being carried away on the wind if we're launching on a breezy day. Okay. If you don't have the snap swivel, don't worry about it. You can actually put off putting the parachute on until just before you're ready to launch. So, unless you're trying to get this model done in a couple hours and go out and launch it right away, you've got some time there. Okay, so I'm going to leave the parachute off for this next part where we're going to attach the shock cord. So I brought back the rest of the rocket here, and this is actually pretty simple. To attach the shock cord, you simply pass that through the same eyelet there that the parachute will go on, and just put 2 overhand knots in it. Okay, so there's one, and one more. And try and keep the excess here to a minimum. You do want some to come off the knot here, but you don't want 5 or 6 inches of that. So get that pretty tight. And then take just a little bit of your all-purpose glue, either type, and just put a little bead of glue, just a little dot of glue right there on the knot, and just kind of work it around. And this will help keeping it from becoming accidentally untied, which could cause you to lose your nose cone and most likely the parachute with it. And then cut this off, not right at the knot, but about a 1/4 inch or about 5 millimeters from the knot. So you've got a little bit of excess there, because as the glue soaks into that and dries, it'll provide a block against that knot, so it's less likely to come untied. Okay, and then for storage, if you don't have the parachute on there, you can simply take all this and pass it down inside. Okay, and put that together like this. Now, I'm not going to leave this here like this for very much longer, as I do want the glue to dry inside without the possibility of that shot cord sticking to its mount or the glue or something else. But I do want to show you now how to put the fillets on. So my launch lugs here have dried, and now I'm going to take my white glue and put a bead right along the edge here. Okay, and then I'm going to take my finger and wipe out most of that. So I'm going to wipe away there. Okay, and be really careful not to get glue on the insides of the launch lugs, because that can interfere with the launch. Now, if you've got a lot of glue back in your finger yet, you can use that to do the other side. Now, if you're doing this and you notice the launch lug is moving, then stop and come back and do it again later. Okay, I'm going to add a little more glue there. Okay. Both directions just to fill it in. Notice there's like a little air bubble there. That may or may not pop. If it does, as it's gluing and you end up a little divot there and you don't like that, just go ahead and add a little more glue to it. Same here, where it's not quite reached the edge of the launch lug, you might want to fill it in with more glue. But don't try and do it all at once. You'll actually cause more problems than you solve if you try and fix those all at once there. Okay, now I'm going to do the back one as well. Alright, so this does serve a cosmetic purpose. It makes them look a little bit more streamlined and part of the model. It also helps reduce what's called interference drag, which is air friction around where two objects join. And it also helps strengthen it. So these little launch lugs, if there's a gust of wind or something while the rocket's on the launch pad, they're taking all of that force. So you want these fairly strong. Okay, and again, I've got some little gaps there on either end. I'll come back later and fill those in. This is a good place to apply a little bit of patience. Let these dry, add a little bit more to them. You don't need to add layer upon layer upon layer, but don't try and fix the air gaps all at once. Just let those dry a bit more and then come back and add a little more glue to it. Okay, that's pretty much the end of the build for this rocket. The only thing left to do is put the stickers on, and those are meant to go on the fins here. I'm not going to do that because that's one of those really boring things of watching someone put on stickers. These simply peel off and stick onto where you want them. If you want to store the parachute inside the rocket, simply fold it, and you can pretty much follow the directions that are shown in the instructions here for preparation for launch. The only thing that we don't do is generally store it with the recovery wadding in it. Recovery wadding for the most part looks like toilet paper. It kind of looks like this. It's not actually toilet paper. This is treated tissue paper so that it's flame retardant. If you use regular toilet paper, it will come down smoking and flaming and possibly be a fire hazard. Okay, but that is usually applied down in here, and it provides a barrier between the hot gases of the ejection charge of the motor and this relatively delicate plastic that could be easily burned or melted. Okay, so if you are preparing this for flight, you want to put the wadding in first and then put in the parachute and the shock cord. If you're just storing it though, you can simply draw this whole thing together. So it's about like this. Alright, maybe even give it one more fold like that. I like to fold it down roughly in half. Okay, and then bring my shroud lines up, just kind of loosely folding them in. And then I'm going to fold this lengthwise together, kind of roll it into a cigar shape here like this. In the earlier days of rocketry, people often would pull this lengthwise and then tightly roll it up all the way down. That has kind of fallen out of favor because a lot of times it doesn't unroll completely. Alright, and then you can just insert this into the tube. Now, again, if you've got a snap swivel, make sure it's attached and completely snapped on. Alright, I have not changed this one out for the bigger one yet. Alright, but that has to be completely snapped down if you're going to use that. Otherwise you could lose your parachute in flight. And then take any of your excess shock cord, stuff it down gently. You don't want to get shock cord or shroud lines stuck between the nose cone and the body tube, and just stick it together like that. Okay, and this is ready to be displayed however you like. I will have another video that shows how to prep basic rockets like this for launch, including adding the wadding and putting the motor in, but we'll do that as a separate video. Alright, hope you had as much fun building this as I did, and hopefully fewer problems than the ones I showed you. Okay, have a good flight.